Our next major process thinker was George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. He was born in 1770 and died in 1831. Hegel's philosophy has its origins in a flash of mystical insight. The universe is just one thing. Similar to Spinoza, of course, and similar to the mystical insights of pretty much any mystic in any world religion, any time in history. Nevertheless, he had this experience, and it changed his outlook. It's a common starting point for mystics, but it's not a popular starting point for philosophers, so we have to give him that. His philosophy was really the first in Western philosophy to critique the parts mentality. While all around him, scientists were breaking reality down into its constitutive elements, Hegel warned us to take a step back and see the whole picture. Only the whole is real, he tells us. Everything we're looking at needs to be seen in terms of its relationship with everything else. Otherwise, our view is distorted. Now, this is a remarkably postmodern perspective, and it resonates with many contemporary philosophies such as chaos theory and the Gaia hypothesis, neither of which would be possible without the thinkers that we're talking about today. Hegel even provides us with a creation myth. He says, in the beginning, God was pure mind, pure being. Since God was alone, God attempted to think about God's self. After all, it was dreadfully dull, and as God was the only subject and the only object in existence, what else would God have to do? Unfortunately, the thought of pure being is impossible, apparently even for God. So when God tried to think about God's self, God thought about nothing instead. Actually, God thought about no thing, the very opposite of being. But since God is God's thought, God's failure to comprehend God's self resulted in an internal distance being created. Hegel calls this God's self-alienation. This appears in Western mythology, he says, as the figure of Satan. God's self-alienated essence and the opposite of God's pure being is personified in his thinking by the figure of Satan. This alienation proved to be quite catastrophic for God, who has spent most of the life of the universe trying to reconcile God to God's self. Are you still with me? Yeah. So what we have here is a God of two minds who can't seem to get it together. God can neither recapture the womb-like coziness of pure being, nor can God be content with annihilation. All of history then falls somewhere in between, this vast space that Hegel calls becoming. All the universe participates in this becoming. In fact, the project of the universe is to reacquaint God with God's self. Apparently, in trying to think about God's self, God lost God's self, and so the whole vast drama of history is God's attempt to remember who God was. So let that be a lesson to you not to be too self-absorbed. What we end up here with is a kind of Western Hinduism. The universe exists only as a way for God to rediscover God's self. In Hinduism, however, this self-revelation is intentional and playful. But in Hegel's system, there's an element of desperation involved. God's self-alienation is an extremely uncomfortable state for the Almighty. And God is not only not playful, but is not at all happy about the situation. Not only that, but it's taking way too long to sort this little mess out. But according to Hegel, that's God's problem. For us, it's just the neighborhood that we live in. Hidden in this creation myth is Hegel's great gift to human thought, what we now call the Hegelian dialectic. God's pure being was the thesis, and God's subsequent thought of no thing was the antithesis. And the resultant ongoing process of becoming is the synthesis. This process, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, Hegel subsequently applied to everything, from politics to history to religion. And in so doing, he revealed history not as a static list of events, but as a dynamic process in which every action is connected to the movement of the whole. Every element is affected by every other element, and each event is formed and informed by those events that have gone before it. It's easy to see just how helpful this insight was. Suddenly, history made a whole lot more sense. Even biology finds this expression useful. Even when applied to our own smaller stories, this dialectic yields some really insightful results. For instance, my own spiritual journey makes a lot more sense when thought about in terms of Hegel's theory. I began my religious quest as a Southern Baptist, a denomination that stresses individualism and congregational polity. In college, I was converted to Anglo-Catholicism, which is the very antithesis of my childhood faith, in that it stresses communal life and is hierarchical in its polity. After many years, God led me to my current parish, where we formed a synthesis that we sometimes call congregational Catholicism, which preserves the best of both worlds, being both communal and self-governing. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's not hard to see this simple trifold pattern, and I invite you to explore your own history with this dialectic in mind. It may yield some surprising insights, or as I prefer to call it, great stuff to work on in therapy.